Thank you, Rabbi Kelman. Welcome, everybody. These are obviously tumultuous times for all of us. Like Rabbi Kelman said, I'll just share with you. I found it humorous because I was watching Israeli news last night, watching the video footage of the Iranian parliament cheering like a bunch of high school kids at a basketball game at what they presume to be a tremendous victory, which Baruch Hashem was, of course, just a lot of sound and fury indicating nothing, to take from Shakespeare. In any case, Baruch Hashem and Hinei lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. We could certainly feel that this morning. I'd like to address with you, and I know some of you have been all morning in this amazing program, and so we are up to the point, the actual kishkes of Haggadah. And to point out, just as an introduction, that the core of the mitzvah of Haggadah is in 2 points. The first is the one that we're going to be dealing with today, and the second one, which I'll address briefly, I don't want to take away from anybody else's shiur, but is Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer Kol Shalom Amar Shlosha Dvarim Elu Pesach Lo Yitzeh Yedei Chavato Pesach Matzah Umaror, which is explaining the 3 vital symbols at the table. And these seem to reflect 2 different approaches to what the evening is about. As you know, and you've already heard about it, there's a famous story that we read at the Seder about the 5 Chachamim sitting up all night in Bnei Brak sharing the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. The noticeably absent member of that elite cadre of Chachamim at that evening is Rabban Gamliel. And yet there's a Tosefta that records that Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim stayed up all night discussing Hilchot HaPesach. And it seems to be 2 different approaches to what Haggadah is. Is it mainly telling the story of the Exodus, as it were, or is it mainly being engaged in the laws of the Korban Pesach? And Rabban Gamliel seems to champion the latter, both in how he engaged in the evening and also in the obligation that he gave us. But we're going to look at the other piece, which seems to be the more popular one, although in reality we do both at the Seder, and that is as follows. If you take a look at the sources on the page, the first source is the Mishnah in Psachim. As you probably all know, and you've probably already heard this morning, remember, we're coming to a day which is Lo Yom V'lo Laila, so morning, evening, it's all the same. In the Mishnah Psachim, the last parak Erev Psachim or Arvei Psachim, is basically a guide to the Seder. And a lot has been written on whether or not that parak reflects the Seder in the times of the Mikdash, or it was only afterwards. There seem to be pieces of it that go back to the times of the Mikdash. In any case, as you see in front of you in the first source, you have the obligation to pour the second cup. The child asks questions. How do we deal with manishtana? And then the order is matchil bignut u'mesayem b'shavach, and I have it translated underneath. V'doresh mi'arami oved avi ad shu gomer kol ha'parasha. And so this is kind of where we're going to start. There's an introduction to the Tzeh Ulemad section, because Tzeh Ulemad comes because of this line in the Mishnah. And the order is you begin with disgrace and end with praise. So the first question is, what does disgrace mean? So the famous machloket between Rav and Shmuel, or Rav and Rava, different gersaot in the Gemara. Rav says gnut refers to the fact that we were originally idolaters. And the shevach is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us close to his avodah. However, that's actually not explicit in the Gemara. What is explicit is that the gnut is that we were originally idolaters. And Shmuel or Rava, whoever the opposing number is, says the gnut is avadim hayinu. Now, in reality, we do both of those. But it raises an interesting question about the relationship between gnut and shevach, between disgrace and praise. Whose disgrace are we recounting in the Haggadah? It sounds like our disgrace. We were idolaters, or we were slaves. But whose praise is it? And that's what's kind of awkward here, because you would think that the gnut and the shevach should go sort of hand in hand, in that if the gnut is our disgrace, then it should be our praise. But we don't praise ourselves at the Seder, we praise Hashem. So there's something imbalanced about that. And we'll see a little bit further on as we go ahead how that perhaps gets resolved. But the Mishnah then gives us the directive to teach or to expound from the passage Arami Oved Avi. So I brought you the passage here from Dvarim Chavav. And there's two broad questions to ask before we get into the passage. The first thing is that this passage that you're looking at is incomplete. As you notice in the Mishnah, it says, Doresh mi'arami oved avi ad shu gomer kol parasha, meaning you're supposed to expound from the words arami oved avi until you finish the entire parasha. The problem is the 4 psukim you see in front of you are not the end of the parasha. Critically, there is a pasuk that follows immediately after the one that ends here, which is Vayivienu ala makom hazeh, that God brought us to this land, and He gave us this land. And then it goes on and says, and I have brought the first fruits of the land that you gave me. Meaning there's much more in this declaration than is what we recite at the Seder. We don't go ad shomer kol parasha, which is what led many scholars to believe that originally, in the times of the Mikdash, they read more than this. They included the next pasuk, which was, and God brought us to this land, because that's something that, of course, in their day was something they could say wholeheartedly, and as opposed to after the destruction. In any case, this is the part that we recite, and you notice that the shevach, of course, at the end is the praise for Hashem taking us out. But what is the gnut? What is the disgrace with which this starts off? So if we read the psukim, we see that the disgrace seems to be not something embarrassing or bad about our behavior, but just something lowly about our station. And that the gnut and shavach perhaps should be read differently than disgrace and praise. It should be perhaps describing being in a lowly position and ending with our being in a noble position, in which case it's symmetrical. The gnut and the shavach are all about Am Yisrael. One last thing about this paragraph before we look at the words themselves. As you see it, this paragraph is from Dvarim Chavav. Dvarim Chavav, which is at the very end of the Ne'um HaMitzvot, Moshe's mitzvah speech, which makes up the bulk of Sefer Devarim, is a mitzvah that has nothing to do with Pesach. It's a mitzvah of bringing bikurim, which happens in the summer. And when a farmer brings his figs or his dates or his grapes or whatever the Shiva Minim he brings, seasonally, somewhere between Shavuot and Chanukah, he makes a declaration. And the declaration includes these 4 sentences plus more, which of course concludes with, and Hashem brought us to the land, and here's the fruit of the land, I'm giving it to you, Hashem. The first fruits, the bikurim. So why is it that we're using this as the core text at the Seder? Why don't we use the core text from Sefer Shmot or even from Sefer Dvarim, where the story of the Exodus is recounted? Even passages in Bamidbar could be used. But instead, we are going to a passage which has nothing to do with Pesach. And the reason why Soloveitchik explains as follows, and it's a beautiful explanation. He says that the goal of the evening is not purely educational in the sense of informational. It's not just passing on data about the Exodus. The purpose of the evening is to make the evening an evening of Shira, of Hallel, of thanking God. And the only place that we have in Tanakh in which the story of the Yetziat Mitzrayim is told in the context of Shira, of thanksgiving, is Mikra Bikurim, is this passage, where it's used in the context not of passing on information, but of praising God.
Don't you think that the key word is doresh? That the mitzvah.
Sorry, I apologize, but I want, because of the time, I won't be able to take questions. I apologize. Okay, and so the context here, because it's a context of Shira, is the context that we use for praising God. Now let's take a look at the psukim themselves. I've translated the psukim as the literal translation of the Pshat translation, which is going to get me into hot water right at the beginning, because the opening phrase is Arami Oved Avi, and that's very famous because that's going to take us to the very beginning of the midrash that we have on it. And of course, the direction is the Doresh Me'arami Oved Avi. You have to expound, which means you take these psukim and then use them as a launching pad for explaining more and delving deeper into the psukim. Arami Oved Avi, the simple pshat of it is that the subject of that phrase is Avi, my father. And what are we saying about my father? My father is either Yaakov or Avraham, was a wandering Syrian. Because it's true, Avraham came from Aram, perhaps born there, perhaps not. Machloket Rishonim, but he came from Haran. And Yaakov had lived in Aram for many years and then left, came back to Israel. And he was wandering, he was lost. Vayered Mitzrayma. And then he came down to Egypt. Vayagor Sham b'mtei miat. Now, Vayagor is a great example of a word that in modern Hebrew is used very differently than it's used in Tanakh. But lagur, and from there you get the word ger, means to really come in as a visitor and be an outsider. And so Yaakov came to Egypt as an outsider with a small group, and there he became a big, powerful, and numerous nation. Right? That's part one of the story. Now you notice that each of these lines is a different prong in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, starting with the descent. And for simplicity's sake, we'll refer to the first pasuk as galut, exile. Vayareu otano mitzrim vayanunu, the second verse, the Egyptians dealt badly with us and afflicted us. Vayinu aleinu avodah kasha, and they put hard work on us. Now, what we're looking at is something we refer to as a historiosophy. It's a retelling of history with a particular agenda, which we see all over in Tanakh, Yoshua Chaf Daled, and in Shmuel Aleph Perek Yud Bet, and in parts of Nehemiah, all sorts of places in which we take a story and conflate the events and push them together, and perhaps even the sequence is not accurate to the narrative, because the purpose is all true events to give us a message. And here you see that we've gone from Yaakov's descent to Egypt all the way until the slavery, which is a passage of several hundred years, very quickly, without any details. Yosef's not mentioned here. And we come to the third pasuk. So the second pasuk we could easily call Avdut. So galut, avdut, exile, slavery. Works better in Hebrew. Vanitzak el Adonai Elohei Avotenu. What did we do? We cried out to Hashem. Not exactly clear from Sefer Shemot that we prayed. We did cry out, but it sounds like we cried out in pain. Unclear that we actually prayed to Hashem for salvation. Vayishma Adonai kolenu. Hashem heard our voice. Vayart onyenu et amalenu et lachatzenu. We saw our pain, our affliction, etc. And then we could call that pasuk tefillah. And then the fourth pasuk, which of course fits the theme of 4 in the Seder, which is common. God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, an outstretched arm, etc. All the descriptions of how Hashem took us out. Those are the psukim we're supposed to expound on. And again, as I mentioned, it seems that that these psukim were chosen because they really do fit the model of Shirah, of Thanksgiving. But let's take a look at the Midrashim. And what we do in our Haggadah is, and you have it laid out here page by page, is we start with the first pasuk and then take it apart, and each phrase is expounded. And you see it here. However, you notice that I have highlighted some of the Midrashim, and you'll see why. Tzeh Ulemad, this is how we begin the Midrash. Tzeh Ulemad is a rabbinic idiom that means investigate. It literally means go out and learn, but you don't have to leave the building. Ma bikesh Lavan ha'arami lasot liYaakov Avinu. Look what Lavan ha'arami, Yaakov's father-in-law, wanted to do to Yaakov. Sheparo arashalo gazar el zcharim. Paro's decree was only about the boys, meaning to kill the boys. And now what we're looking at as a contrast between Paro and Lavan from the perspective of Paro's first decree, which was to throw the boys in the water. But Lavan bikesh lakor et hakol. Lavan tried to destroy everything. And how do we know that? Shenemar arami oved avi. Now we go back to that first pasuk, and we're reading it differently than most people will believe is the pshat reading. Instead of arami oved avi, meaning avi haya arami oved, my father was a wandering arami. Instead, read it as arami is the subject. Oved then becomes a transitive verb to destroy, and avi is the object. Arami tried to destroy my father. And who's my father? My father is Yaakov. So the Arami becomes the famous Arami in Tanakh, which is Lavan. So before we go any further, how is it that Lavan tried to destroy Yaakov? What did Lavan do to try to destroy Yaakov? Remember that the one time that they have an actual confrontation is when Yaakov runs away in chapter 31 of Breshit, When Yaakov flees Lavan, when Lavan has gone in the other direction to shear his sheep, and Yaakov takes off to go south, and Lavan catches up with him on Har HaGilad, and they have the confrontation. And Lavan is angry at him for leaving without a party and a goodbye. And Lavan is angry because he's stolen his gods, the famous story with Rachel and the Trafim. And Lavan says to Yaakov, I could hurt you, but your God appeared to me at night and told me that I better not say anything, confirming God's protection of Yaakov. But we don't know that Lavan actually tried to do anything. I mean, it's his own kids, his own daughters, his own grandchildren. We don't know that. But if you look a little bit further back and then look into Jewish history, and there's a very powerful lesson here. Who has been our worst enemy in history? So one can make the argument the Egyptians. It's a not very solid argument. One could make the argument that the Greeks or the Romans, that would be a more solid argument. One could certainly make point to more contemporary villains. From Chazal's perspective, our worst enemy is ourselves. Chazal's perspective, and from a perspective of the theological interpretation of Jewish history, is our worst enemies have been ourselves. After all, when we talk about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in the year 70, the most common reason we point to is sinat chinam, is Jews aren't getting along with each other. Jews are at each other's throats, and that's what destroys us. And so you take a look at Lavan. What was the one thing Lavan did that we can point to as a deliberate disruption? And I think pretty safely we could point to Lavan's switching the wives. Because what did Lavan know? Lavan knew that Yaakov really wanted to marry Rachel, which means what had Lavan really coordinated? And the Midrash says this in different ways. He had coordinated to have Yaakov married to two sisters, meaning he would now have Yaakov locked in as potentially the heir of the estate by marrying both of his daughters. At the time, Lavan didn't have any sons, evidently, and the sons come later. And so by locking him in, he has sort of forced Yaakov's hand into being married to two sisters at one time. As we see, that is a disaster, and it leads to disaster. It actually leads us to Egypt because the brothers hate Yosef, because Yosef is favored by Yaakov, because Yosef is Rachel's son, etc. And that's what leads us to Egypt. And that's all if we want to, we can all look back and say, we could point to Lavan's mischievous manipulation of the situation that caused that. And so therefore, Lavan bikesh lakor takol, Lavan attempted to really destroy everything by forcing Yaakov into an impossible family situation, which he navigated admirably, but it was still difficult and with tremendous cost. So that perhaps may be what this Midrash is saying. One other thing about Lavan HaArami is many have pointed out, and I think there's a lot to recommend this approach, is that we have to remember that the core text of our Haggadah was formulated in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, chiefly in Yavna at the end of the 1st century and in the beginning of the 2nd century. And at that time, and we have lots of records of this in Chazal, there were many periods during which we had to avoid any interaction with the Roman authorities, the Roman sovereigns. And things were touchy and way worse than touchy at many times. And it's possible that what Chazal were instituting here with this Midrash about Lavan HaArami as being worse than Paro is if you read Arami and just read it a little bit more flexibly, you end up with Lavan HaRomai. And this may be Chazal's way of us describing the enemy without saying it out loud. And it's something that, by the way, we have done throughout history. In circumstances where we could not speak aloud, we spoke about certain biblical characters, and wink, wink, we're really talking about the contemporary Jew hater who was oppressing us. So another observation here about Lavan and his role here. One other thing I want to point out, which is true throughout all of these midrashim, before we get to the next pasuk, is you will notice that these midrashim are of a peculiar type. They're not the kind of midrashim we're accustomed to seeing. The purpose of midrash ostensibly is to explain things, is to expand on things, to see things that the pasuk says and see there's more I can find in here. Take a look at the midrashim. You see that, for instance, Arami Over Avi, we've expounded, that's referring to Lavan, etc. The next one, which is the Aleph here, Vayered Mitzrayim, and you could see it, and he descended to Egypt, has an explanation. Anus al Piyad Dibur. But take a look, for instance, at the third one, Gimel. It doesn't really say anything. All it has is Bimtei Ma'at, which means we came down with a small number. And then you have a pasuk saying, yeah, we came down with a small number, Kamo Shenemar. And quite a few of them, of the Midrashim, are simply what we call supportive Midrashim, meaning the pasuk says X, and I'm saying I know that X is true because elsewhere it says Y, which is the same as X. And many of them work that way. You take a look, for instance, at Daled and Aleph here are explanatory. Vayihi Sham L'Goy, they became a nation. This teaches that they were a distinct group. And then you have something like Bet, which is a combination, in which you have a midrash that explains what the pasuk means and then gives support to that explanation, which is Vayagor Sham, V'lamed Shelo Yarad Lishtakel Agor Sham Shenemar, meaning it explains what the phrase in our pasuk means, and then it provides another pasuk to support that explanation. And we find all three types in these midrashim. When we get to the next pasuk, and I've highlighted them throughout, you can copy the sources. When you take a look at the next pasuk, pasuk 2, you will see that none of them explain anything. All it says is the Egyptians dealt badly with us, etc. And each midrash is just Kamo Shenemar, a supportive midrash, no explanatory midrash, meaning we get no new insights into what this means, but it rather just gives us support that this is indeed what happened. Which, if you think about it, is kind of strange, beyond the purview of our time frame to go into that. When you look at the third pasuk, which is about tefillah, about our prayer to God, you find something strange happening, which is that in the first two midrashim, they're just supportive, just psukim. Gimel, Dalet, and Hey, the last three, all are a hybrid. They explain what the phrase means, and then they give support. But the support is kind of strange. Take a look at Gimel. Vayar et onyenu. God saw our affliction. The explanation is Zo prishut derech eretz. Now, what does derech eretz mean? And the answer is it very much depends on context. Derech eretz could mean secular culture if you're in a Rav Hirsch kind of mood. Derech eretz can mean a job if you are in perhaps a Mishneh kind of mood. Derech eretz in rabbinic literature also is a euphemism for marital relations. And Vayaret onyenu, God saw our affliction, which means God saw that men and women had stopped cohabiting because they were having kids, and the kids were being killed. There was no point to having kids. Famous midrash of Miriam and Amram, etc. Miriam talking to her father about that. So Vayaret onyenu, God saw our affliction. Zu prishut derech eretz. But then it brings a proof text, and the proof text doesn't really prove anything to our point. Promotion Amar, Vayaru Elohim b'nei Yisrael, Vayeda Elohim. Hashem saw b'nei Yisrael, and Hashem knew. What does that mean? How does that connect to that? So there's all sorts of explanations that you'll find in your Haggadot. Vayeda, kind of alluding to Hadam Yada et Chava, the word Yada as an allusion to marital relations, perhaps. Vayar Elohim, God saw, meaning something that only God could see. Perhaps. But the simplest explanation here is that there really were two sets of midrashim. And this we say about the whole section. There was a set of midrashim that was simply Kamo Shenemar, meaning here's a phrase in the Mikra Bikurim, and here's a pasuk in Shmot, or in elsewhere in Dvarim, or in Yechezkel, or in Yoel, that supports that pasuk. And then there was another set of midrashim that was explanatory, that said this is what the phrase means. And at some particular point, these two sets got merged. So you have Vayaret onyenu zo prishut derech eretz, that's Midrash 1, or Vayaret onyenu kamo shenemar Vayarim b'nei Yisrael v'yed Elohim. God saw and God knew, meaning he saw that we were in pain, not the particular notion, kind of pain. But when the hybrid comes together, it creates something of a difficulty that we have to sort of negotiate. The most interesting pasuk in this whole thing and the way it's developed in the Midrash is the last one. So the last one has several components that are unmatched in the whole system, meaning it's unique here. In the first of all, it has an embedded Midrash. It starts with Vayotzienu Adonai Mitzrayim. God took us out of Egypt, and then describes a strong hand, etc. And the Midrash on the first phrase, Vayotzienu Adonai Mitzrayim, is that God took us out on his own, without an agent. And this is the very famous passage which rejects or sort of hides the agency of Moshe in the whole story, Moshe and Aharon in the whole story. Lo Yedei Malach, Lo Yedei Saraf, right? And then that Midrash has a Midrash on it, meaning how do we know that God took us out alone? Because we have another Pasuk. That fits what we've seen so far. But then that Pasuk gets a Midrash. 4 different times in the Pasuk describing Makat Bachorot, the first person singular is used. I will go through Egypt. I will smite, etc. And each one is used. I am not an angel. I am not a seraph. I am not an agent. I alone, I Hashem, and no other. So it's again a unique piece. There's another unique piece that we're going to see here with 3 minutes remaining. As you see in Bet Gimel Daled Hey and Vav, it goes through each one of the 5 phrases that describes God's redemption: a strong hand, an outstretched arm, etc. And it defines them and gives a pasuk. And now we have support. How do we know that Dever, the cattle plague, is a strong hand? Because when Moshe announces the cattle plague, Hashem has said, I'm going to hit you with my hand, a strong hand. The outstretched arm. Now, this is strange because we say the outstretched arm refers to a sword. Where is there a sword in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? All of your Haggadot will have commentaries on this. And then the proof text is a text in Divrei Hayamim, which describes the plague in Yerushalayim after David's census. And the Malach there with his sword outstretched, the same word outstretched. Morah Gadol, great awe and fear. This is the revelation of the Shekhinah. What is that talking about? When did the Shekhinah appear as part of Makot Mitzrayim? And then there's a proof text. Otot, signs, this refers to Moshe's staff. And Moftim, these are wonders, this refers to Dam. And then a pasuk from Yoel, which is famous for us because it's when we start dipping the wine out. What's strange about this is that, first of all, like we said, where is the revelation of Shekhinah as part of the story of the Makot? The second thing is that if you look at the last item on the page, you'll see there's a whole other midrash, Davar Acher, which says Biyad Chazakah, that's 2 words, that's Shtayim. Zoran Tuyah, it's 2 words, that's Shtayim. Morah Gadol, it's 2 words, that's Shtayim, that's 2. Otot is plural, Moftim is plural, 2 times 5 is 10. That's the Esser Makot, and then we recite the Esser Makot. What's this Davar Acher? So Professor David Henschke, who's written a masterful work on the Haggadah called Manishtana, gives the following explanation. He says that what we have is 2 different midrashim, and indeed, this first midrash, the longer one that goes through line Vav, does not appear in Eretz Yisrael material. It's all Babylonian, and in Eretz Yisrael material, all you see is the last one. And it's not called Davar Acher. It simply goes through all 5 words. Each one represents 2 makot. That's 10 makot. So as you take a look at it, you have to think, who were the makot for? Were the makot for us or for the Egyptians? So the easy explanation is for the Egyptians. And other plagues were there in order to frighten them and to convince them, etc. But the makot may indeed have been also for us. Remember, the first people that Moshe was supposed to do the signs in front of were the Ziknei Yisrael, to convince them of his agency. And so he makes the following suggestion, that the first midrashim here, Biyad Chazakah, etc., all refer to things that were for the benefit of Am Yisrael. And that's why the Cherev, because what did Bnei Yisrael say? What did Moshe say? We have to go out to the desert and worship our God, because otherwise he may encounter us with the sword. That's the sword we're referring to. Pen b'cherev tzedek ratecha, right? And the Morah Gadol, the Gilui Shekhinah, is referring to God's revealing himself to Am Yisrael. The Otot is the signs that Moshe used in front of Ziknei Yisrael. And the Moftim are the wonders. The Dam, remember, was the first of the plagues, but it was also before that a sign that Moshe gave in front of the Zakinim by pouring the water onto the ground, having it turn into blood. The Davar Acher then looks at the Makot from a whole different perspective, that the Makot really were there as an educational message to the Egyptians. And so what you have is this midrash, this complex midrash. The first half of it is essentially looking at the redemption and the process of the redemption as essentially being a statement to us. The Egyptians are in Nebuch, they're in the way. It's a statement to us. It's teaching us about God, about our relationship with God, and about the redemption. The second one takes a look at the Makot in a much more, what we might call prosaic position, which is the Makot were there to liberate us and to teach the Egyptians who they're messing with and not to mess further. There's much more to say about this Midrash, but I'm sure you have wonderful teachers coming along to teach you from here on in. And so I will wish you all a Chag Kavshav Sameach, and it should really be a month of Nisim v'Niflaot and of Geulat Am Yisrael, Geulah Shlema, and we should all be Shruim al Admatenu v'Cherev Lo Ta'avor Ba'aretz.